Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Magic Sandwich Show. I am your host for this evening, JD Kain. Tonight's topic, we've got Floyd FP and the Dry Apologist. Dry Apologist is a Catholic. Floyd is, as most people know, an atheist. And the discussion is going to focus on, does biblical Christianity, is it able to support the concepts that are present in evolutionary theory? So basically, as a Christian, can is it possible to make the biblical tale and evolution work? If I remember correctly, Floyd is going to say no, and Dry Apologist is a theistic evolutionist. He's going to say yes. A brief introduction. Floyd, tell us a little about yourself.
Uh, I've been involved in the great debate community on the internet for quite a few years, starting out, I guess, on the, back in the Google Plus days, and it's migrated, I guess, over to where it exists now between, I guess, Facebook and Discord and so forth. I do have a YouTube channel where a lot of my previous shows and debates are on. I don't do whole lot of original videos on my YouTube channel. They end up being mirrors of presentations or shows I've been on, and I'll just copy them and move them over to my channel, so it's all consolidated there. I enjoy talking about religion, about counter apologetics. I'm sure, I guess I'm best known for my presentations against presuppositionalism, but I like to actually focus on the Bible history, and critical scholarship of the Bible. So I guess that's my general background.
All right. So, Dry Apologist, a little bit about yourself.
All right, yeah. So I'm a practicing Catholic, and I have a master's in theology and also an undergrad degree in philosophy. I have a YouTube channel called Dry Apologist. I just have a few videos up. I hope to produce some more. I'm really into debating and discussing. If anybody watching wants to debate or discuss, just message me on YouTube or Twitter, and we'll get something set up, and I'm happy to be here.
So, why Dry Apologist? Why not say Wet Apologist?
Yeah. I tend to be dry.
Apologist?
Yeah. So it kind of blocks that criticism before I get started. So
I don't know. I think maybe you should try Wet Apologist and then replace yourself with, say, 19-year-old in a wet T-shirt. It's like Wet Apologist. Can make it work. Okay, that's.
I don't know about that.
Well, I would be a fan. All right, I'd be watching that every day because I'm a pig. Anyway, so on with the show. So, you are a Catholic, I believe.
Yes.
You're a practicing Catholic. How long have you been a Catholic?
Yeah, I've always been Catholic. So certainly got to college, went more in depth, and studied philosophy, theology more in depth. But yeah, I've always been a practicing Catholic.
Do you consider yourself a Roman Catholic?
Yeah, definitely, yes.
Okay.
Is that actually a distinction?
Well, there are
Roman
Eastern.
Catholic?
Yeah, I mean there is the Eastern Catholic Church, but most people who say they're Catholics are Roman Catholics.
So do you go all in? Do you believe the Pope is super important? God puts him there, et cetera, et cetera. I honestly I only know so much about Catholicism as opposed to your typical evangelical American Christian.
Yeah, I mean, I accept all the doctrinal teachings of the Catholic Church. There's a lot of misconceptions about some of them, so that's a whole discussion in and of itself. But yeah, I subscribe to all the Church's teachings.
Well, it's not entirely on topic, but I will bring this up real quick because I keep getting this from people who hate Catholics. Do you worship Mary?
Yeah, so the answer to that is no. So we do believe that saints can pray for us, so we can invoke Mary to assist us in prayer, but no, Catholics don't, or at least Catholics who are faithful to church teaching do not worship Mary. So
thank you. That's like I knew the answer, but it's important that evangelicals I talk to hear that more and more because it's one of the more frustrating. It's like just listen to what they say. When they say no, they really mean no to that one. All right, so let's start with you, Dry Apologist. So theistic evolution, why that as opposed to creationism? Would you agree that creationism is easier to make work with Genesis?
All right, yeah. So, I mean, the reason why not creationism is because, from my perspective, truth doesn't contradict truth. So, I mean, the scientific evidence does seem to back up evolution. So, I accept that. And then as far as the biblical account, yeah, I mean, a straightforward reading of Genesis is going to perhaps sound creationist, although I don't think that's totally straightforward because the opening chapters are actually a little bit more nuanced. They do talk about the earth bringing forth life. You actually don't get a straightforward creationist picture. That's not to say that it is teaching evolution, but I actually think creationists tend to project their own views into what it says. Also have a more nuanced perspective of biblical inspiration than some Christians do, so we can perhaps talk about that. But yeah, I mean, the science supports evolution, and I don't see a conflict with God using that to create, so I reconcile it all from there.
All right. Floyd, what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think really the conflict I see it is that the Bible offers stories in it which are considered ideological of nature, and ideological means that serving as to explain something by giving a cause or a reason for it, whether it be historical or in mythical terms. So in the Bible we have different stories, and they explain why why we exist, why we have the nature that we do, and so forth. And nothing's more clear example than that than the Adam and Eve story found in Genesis 2 and 3. In that story, as well as Genesis 1, we have a story that tells us where the world came from, why we die, why women have painful childbirth, why we wear clothes, why we have to work hard, and also how we developed our sinful nature, and how that got, I guess, and so forth. And even later, we have stories like the Tower of Babel, which offers an explanation of why humans have different languages and so forth. And then through science, through evolutionary theory, which deals with the origins of species, which Darwin wrote about. We have a story, so to speak, of how Homo sapiens came about, and I think these stories simply conflict each other. I can sum up the problem by quoting one of my favorite Bible scholars, Robert M. Price, in his book Evolving Out of Eden. I think he sums it up quite well. I'll quote a paragraph from the book. He says, despite attempts to minimize the differences between biblical creationists and old earth creationists or theistic evolutionists, the theological problems created by such attempts to harmonize the Bible with billions of years are indeed significant. The order of events in Genesis 1 often have to be rearranged to accommodate such views, and those who wish to mesh evolution with the Bible must accept that there was death, suffering, diseases like cancer, and even thorns before the fall. But all those things are a result of sin. The scripture is explicit that thorns came after the curse. How could God call cancer very good? So that's one basic problem, where the Bible teaches that death and suffering, things like thorns and thistles and so forth, came about because of the fall of Adam and Eve. And that theology extends not only from the Hebrew Bible, but also into the Christian Bible. And we see that in the writings of the Pauline epistles. In Romans 5, for example, we read that, therefore, as sin came in the world through one man and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all men sin. Um, and he goes on to say, if because one man's trespasses death reigned through that one man, much more with those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteous reign in the life of of one man, Jesus Christ. Then, as one man's trespasses laid to the condemnation of all men, so one man's act of righteousness led to the acquittal of life for all men. So here we read that Paul's supposedly Paul, the author of Romans, is expressing that death came in the world because of Adam's transgressions, but through evolutionary theory, death, suffering, diseases like cancer and so forth existed well before man came in the scene. So I just don't see how you can reconcile one view where death and suffering and so forth was kind of like the natural order, and helps shape where humans came from. Through natural selection, other animals died off. Certain species of humanoids died off because of natural pressures and so forth, and there's a long history of death and suffering and so forth, compared to the biblical account, where death and suffering and things like thorns and thistles came about after the first human couple, Adam and Eve, fell from grace. So that's where I think the conflict resides.
All right. Yeah. So, excuse me. Yeah. So, I mean, there are several issues on the table. So one, in Genesis, it talks about creation being good. And I believe it's when it gets to humans that says it's very good. So there is that distinction where some will argue that it wasn't perfect. It was that the humanity was what was perfected, or at least more perfected than the rest of nature. But also in Romans, where Paul talks about all have death because all have sinned. So the traditional interpretation has been that applies to humans and not to other animals, because, and one of the reasons is because animals don't sin. So when it says all die for all have sinned, the context seems to be all humans have sinned. So the idea of animal death predating humans wouldn't be in strict conflict. But also, I mean, there is the view of somebody like William Dembski, who argues that there was a sort of retroactive causality, that the sin of Adam retroactively caused or led to the natural evil, that an animal death that predated Adam. I'm not saying that theory is correct, but that is a way to harmonize the account. But the way that I look at it is that, I mean, I agree, Scripture does, especially like in the earlier parts of the Old Testament, give ideological narratives explaining like, where did this come from, what's the result of this, and I don't take that as necessarily historical in nature. It was an attempt by the writers at giving these sort of origin accounts, but my perspective of inspiration is that God has used the Bible to communicate truths, but that doesn't mean that everything is the clearest revelation. So if somebody points out a contradiction or something that doesn't harmonize with science or the history of the earth, I don't look at that as in conflict with my view of inspiration, and that there is support for that perspective within Catholic theology as well. Not all Christians hold that view. But so perhaps those objections that you raised are in conflict with somebody who has a more rigid view of inspiration, but my perspective is a little more flexible than that. But on a strict reading, I mean, I don't know that Paul's language rules out animal death predating humans, because, again, the distinction about all have sinned, and also Paul is giving a sort of a type. So he's saying that Christ is so Adam is a type of Christ. He foreshadows Christ. While Paul probably did believe there was a literal Adam, or at least that would be plausible interpretation, I don't know that his argument rests upon that claim. He was more drawing upon Old Testament imagery to show how they foreshadowed Jesus. So I don't know that he's necessarily making a historical argument. I think it's plausible that he is, and I'm fine with that. But I think that there's a lot of complicating factors there.
Okay, yeah. So there's different ways to approach the Bible and how we should treat um, Genesis 1 through 3. And I guess, it depends how literal you want to take it. But as a Roman Catholic, I think according to Catholic theology, Adam and Eve were literal persons, right? They're historical beings, and they were the very first humans. I mean, would you agree with that as a Roman Catholic?
So the Catholic teaching has traditionally been that there was an original couple, but the story of Adam and Eve has been seen as figurative in nature. So it depends upon what you mean by was there an original Adam and Eve. There was an original pair of humans at some point that sinned, but the actual narrative is largely symbolic in how it narrates.
Well, I think according to Pope Pius XII in 1950, he wrote a letter. Hopefully, I'll pronounce this right. Humani Generis, where he discusses evolution, and he in it, he states that Adam and Eve were indeed a single pair of people, and all subsequent humans came from them. And he said it would be possible to deny that all human beings are subject to original sin if that was not the case. And going back even farther, there's the Council of Carthage in 418 CE. One of the 8 canons that came about from that council expressed that death did not come to Adam as physical necessity, but through sin. So that that Adam's sin was what brought about at least the death of humans, and so forth. So with evolutionary theory, with the evolving of humans, we have to ask ourselves, when did this first couple exist? Because evolutionary theory doesn't say there was, Homo sapiens started with a single pair of humans, but rather a larger population of humans. So, how can we reconcile that with original sin? You could appeal to some sort of Traducianism to kind of reconcile original sin. But if you have a large population, I don't see how you can square that off with the Catholic teaching of there being one original pair of humans.
Yeah, so there are several factors there. So not all statements from within Catholic teaching have equal weight. So it does depend, but even from a pope, it depends upon how it's pronounced and what the context is. But the traditional teaching has been that, there was an original couple who sinned, but there is debate about what the nature of the death that came about from their sin was. It could have been that sin. One view that's been around is they would have died because that is the natural order for them, but that God raised them up to not die as long as they didn't sin. So that would be compatible with death predating their, the first human's arrival. But there are also different interpretations of how original sin would be transmitted. So traditionally, it's been that it would be through reproduction, but there is a view that it could have been transmuted spiritually. So, there are different ways of understanding how original sin gets spread. But Humani Generis, it does make the statement about that Catholics are free to believe in evolution. But I think the statement that he says is that it would be very difficult to reconcile original sin if there wasn't an original couple. So some have viewed that as not necessarily saying that it would be impossible. And it could have been that he said impossible. But the way I remember it, I think quoted was he said it'd be very difficult. And that does give a little bit of leeway. So, there's debate. I acknowledge that the traditional teaching has been that there was an original human pair, they sinned, and that led to physical death for other humans when original sin was passed on. But teachings do also develop, and there is room for theological speculation and debate. So I would argue that in some sense it can be a debated question, but that's my view.
Yeah, there's kind of two views, which, as my understanding, the Catholic Church doesn't pick either of them. But the first one was presented by, I think the earliest church father was Tertullian. It's a concept of traduciism. Hopefully I'm saying that right. And that's the idea that our souls are derived from the souls of our parents. And that's in contrast to creationism, where each one of our souls comes directly from God. But with traduciism, Adam's soul came directly from God, but every soul since then came from Adam, where Eve came from Adam's side or rib, so Eve's soul would be derived from Adam's soul, and then Adam and Eve's offspring would then come from Adam and Eve, and that's how original sin, so to speak, gets passed, because the soul is being derived from our parents rather from directly from God, who's obviously sinful. But later church fathers, such as Augustine, for example, who kind of came up, I guess with kind of like a formal view of original sin. He kind of liked the idea of traduciism, but he didn't fully buy into it. I don't think he decided one way or the other. And I think since then, the Catholic Church really hasn't taken a stand on one way or the other. But it raises the question of at what stage in evolutionary history did original sin come into being? If Homo sapiens came about through a whole population rather than one couple, I find it difficult to reconcile that with original sin. And also, I mean, even go back to Genesis 1. Humans are supposed to be the image bearers of God. So, at what stage in evolution did humans become the image bearers of God? Was Adam and Eve some sort of special creation within humans? But again, if there's a whole population, it seems like other humans would come about, outside of the offspring of Adam and Eve. And then also, historically, at what time did the fall of man occur? If you have death and suffering and so forth, even before humans came on the scene, what actually is the significance of the fall as described in Genesis 3? Because in the theological story we found in Genesis 3, it explains why women have painful childbirth, why women are subservient to men, why work is hard, why thorns and thistles came about, and so forth, and even describes how death came about for humans. From dust you came, and from dust you shall return. I find all this very hard to reconcile. I think evolution is a better explanation for all those things. But yet the Bible has its own story, and I just don't see how they're reconcilable.
Sure. Yeah, so the Catholic Church has spoken against traducianism at one point. It's more of a Protestant perspective now, but I don't know the document. But yeah, the Catholic Church's position is the creationist in the sense of not biological creationist, but the soul being directly created by God. But in regards to sorry, I made a couple of points there. Yeah, I mean, I agree that the Bible in Genesis gives a number of ideological points, and I don't know that those one would have to subscribe to. I don't know that they're essential Christian doctrines. That is how the story goes. But from the perspective that Adam was so that Christ was the second or last Adam, and he, died for the atoned for his sins, and that Adam could have been raised up to immortality to not die, but then he failed that test. So one perspective is that Adam was going to die, but God gave him immortality, and then he was given a test, and then he failed, and then it went back to mortality. So that's not, of course, what the Genesis account strictly says, but again, it gets into how much does it tell us, how much should we expect it to tell us, but that is a perspective, and I would see that as being compatible with the concupiscence and also the death that led up to Adam. So it could have been that God took a special primate and gave him this sort of prerogative as a test, and then he failed, and then it continued on with the course of history. So I mean, that is one perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the way I see the Genesis 3 story is that Adam was free to eat any tree within the garden, and except from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So another tree in the garden would be the tree of life, and so God did not restrict Adam from that. So I think eating that, it's the ambrosia of the gods. So Adam was free to eat from the tree of life, but once he sinned and was expelled from the garden, God put a cherubim with a flaming sword to block Adam and Eve from entering it, and that kept them from the tree of life. And eventually, I think hundreds of years later, Adam does physically die. But while in the garden, he was free to eat from the tree of life. So as long as he had access to it, he would live forever. But as far as evolutionary theory is concerned, it just seems like death is the natural order in which species came about. Through selective pressures. Some species are able to reproduce and live on, while other ones don't. And then the Homo sapiens came about because of those selective pressures. We're simply able to reproduce in our environment where other humanoids, such as Homo erectus and so forth, simply just died out. So I think those two different stories kind of shape our worldviews in different ways, and trying to incorporate the biblical story into that. It doesn't seem to really add any value or any additional meaning into that. It just seems like this is just two separate worldviews that offer explanations of why we are. And also you can look at the nature of man. I think most Christian denominations, and I think Catholics agree with that as well, is that humans have a fallen nature. We have a sinful nature, and that was a result of the fall. I think with evolutionary theory, we can track some of our traits, back to our evolutionary history. The fact that we can be altruistic because we're a social creature, but we can also be very prejudiced and xenophobic. We like to protect our in-group, for example. So we're xenophobic towards people not like us and so forth. And I think that can be explained through our evolutionary history rather than simply saying, oh, well, we just come from a fallen nature. So anything kind of negative with our nature was a result of Adam and Eve disobeying God.
Yeah. So, I don't see that the Genesis narrative or the theological narrative, the Christian theological narrative, adds scientific data. So I don't see it as that being the purpose. But from a Christian perspective, I see it as adding theological data. So I don't see, so evolution, if that's the way God created, which I'm told that is, I agree that death and competition and such led up to, a number of primates. And then, this perspective that I'm offering, I'm not set on this view, but from this perspective that God then took one of the primates and gave him this special prerogative, special test, and then he failed that test. And then that went back to, you could say, the status quo of, creatures dying and struggling with this concupiscence, this competition. So I don't see that as being out of line with the evolutionary picture. It's more of a special moment in history, if you want to say. And then access to the tree of life, yeah, that would have preserved Adam. Now, I view the tree of life, so there's some debate about that, but that's in some ways figurative. In so many ways, I think that prefigures and represents Christ, but that's a whole nother topic. But that would have sustained Adam's and Eve's immortality, but then they were banned from the garden. Not that there was necessarily a literal garden, but that is representative of being closed off from God. So they returned back to this mortality. And I see that as, whether one accepts that view or not, I see that as being compatible with this evolutionary picture. I know that you mentioned being made in the image and likeness of God. So the traditional way of viewing that from a Catholic perspective is that humans have a soul kind of like God, so we have free will and intelligence and reason. So in that sense, we're internally like God in those personal attributes. So that's the way that's viewed. And obviously there are other animals that possess intelligence and such, but I would argue not at the degree that humans have. So that's how I would view that.
Just a quick aside: do the animals that have intelligence also have heaven of sorts, or no?
So that's a debated point. There are some who have argued that point. Some philosophers and theologians, like, these aren't Catholic, but like C.S. Lewis and David Bentley Hart, are two that come to mind that have argued that point. I think there might have been a church father, I want to say like Gregory of Nyssa, but I may be wrong on that point. It hasn't been the traditional view. I sympathize with the perspective that animals have an afterlife, but it is a debated point.
Yeah, there's a view in the scientific community that some higher primates should be treated like should be viewed as persons. I think there was a petition years ago from scientists declaring that dolphins, for example, should be considered as persons, and and we would give them special rights. Don't treat them as though, I guess, unfairly. We treat them like we would treat human person and so forth. So it makes you wonder, in Christian theology, do dolphins or do apes, for example, do they have souls? And what does it actually mean to be an image bearer of God? And can other species be image bearers of God? And it sounds like, according to Genesis 1, the answer is no, that humans are set aside, separate from the animals. And because we are made in the likeness of God, where others are not. But, with evolution, it seems to be, very much a gray issue when we consider, the intelligence and the abilities of these other animals that have evolved. So again, what view is better informing what we're learning, through science and history and so forth? A more secular view, or kind of like the traditional Christian view. It sounds like some Christians are trying to kind of are doing their best to merge them. But I think what Christianity brings to the table is really a fifth wheel. I really don't think it really adds a whole lot to our modern narrative to help explain reality is the way it is. And it creates more questions and problems than answers, I think.
If I may bring up a small point, it's troubling to me that the Bible, like a plain reading of the Bible, can support both a theistic evolutionary position as well as a young Earth creationist position. That I wouldn't expect a book that was inspired by a deity or inspired by people who witnessed the deity to be that malleable in your beliefs. I would expect it to be a bit more specific, where while you might have some disagreement, they wouldn't be quite so wide. What do you think, Dry?
All right, yeah. So I'm going to address that one point for a minute, but there was some that came to mind. So, like Thomas Aquinas, for example, is the foremost theologian within Catholic Church tradition, argued that animals would have died even in the garden. So there is that perspective of animal death being alongside humans even before the fall. So that was one perspective I was going to mention earlier. But also that he also argued, along with Aristotle, that animals have souls, just not a rational soul. They don't have the level of intelligence that a human has. So the way I would look at it is that, yeah, Genesis teaches that humans are made in the image and likeness of God, and that they have this higher intelligence that they can have a sort of guardianship or rulership, if you want to say, over the animals, but it doesn't preclude the animals from having a soul of some kind. And when we get to the book of Isaiah, it talks about the lion or wolf laying down with the lamb. So there is even an eschatological, perhaps afterlife perspective and care for animals. So I do see the Bible making room for animals. Obviously, it's focused on humans, but it depends upon what you mean by image bearer. So somebody like Trent Doherty would argue that in some sense, animals are made in the image and likeness of God, but not in the fullest sense that humans, because they don't have the full rationality and will. And I see that perspective as being compatible with the biblical narrative, since it doesn't really spell out for us what image and likeness mean, but or what it would entail or not entail. But in regard to your question, JD, so yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. If God's inspired the Bible, would it have room for all these different perspectives? So I don't see the Bible as being a science book or even a purely history book, for that matter. I see it as offering a theological narrative, and it gives us, at least from my Catholic perspective, it gives us theological truths and moral truths that we need to know. But I don't see that God used it to communicate scientific data. So, it's kind of open on that. I see that. I mean, honestly, I don't know that the Genesis author or authors had in mind to write a scientific account. The 7 days, 7 was a symbolic number for them, and that was the number of perfection. So it gives these different stages that God creates under. And, I don't see it as being intended to be a scientific account. I don't think that was God's purpose with the Bible. That does raise questions about God's purposes with the Bible and how he inspired it, which is a big debate in of itself, but that would be the way I would go about that.
Yeah, I guess that brings up, how we should interpret the Bible. I think the best way to interpret is to use a historical grammatical method to understand the Bible, to exegete it. And what the historical grammatical method is to interpret the Bible in its historical context, the way the original audience would from the time of the author would understand it. So I know a lot of people, when they read the Bible, they view themselves as the audience. They're saying, okay, what is the Bible telling me? And from my modern perspective. But I think that's a mistake. I think to best understand the Bible, you have to understand the time it was written and how the original audience and the author, in his view, would understand it. And I think from that we'd actually get a better understanding of what the Bible authors were trying to communicate, to their original audience. and I think in that way the Bible would actually make more sense, because obviously there are a lot of questions about the Bible, how to interpret it, what do certain passages mean, and so forth. But in getting back to evolution, I think one problem with classic theism in general, and I think it's a clear problem with Christianity, is the problem of suffering. And with evolutionary theory, I think the evidential problem of evil really comes to surface when we see the millions and millions of years of suffering and death that happened even before humans came on the picture. If there is a God and he used evolution to create life in all the different species that currently exist, he did it in a way in which generated just so much suffering, so much death. Think of all the animals right now as we speak that are getting ripped apart by other animals, that small fish are being swallowed by larger fish. If this God exists, then this guy has no problem with death and so much of it. Can we call this God loving the way he designed the world? If the world is billions of years old, and he formed different species the way that evolutionary theory teaches us, through all the pain and suffering and death. I think biologists say that well over 99% of all species that ever existed are now extinct. Can we reconcile that with a God who in Genesis 1 declares that his creation is very good? And in Psalm 145, we read that this God supposedly loves and takes care of all his creation. Yet, how do we reconcile that with millions and millions of years of pain, suffering, and death? I just don't see how we can reconcile that at all.
All right, sure. So yeah, there's a couple of points there. So in regards to reading the Bible in context, I mean, I absolutely agree that we got to, or at least the best way to go is to read it in the context in which the historical authors most likely intended. So studying context, narrative, so on, sources. But from my perspective, what's to be gained theologically is what God used those narratives for. So again, separating what's the theological teaching and message that God is communicating overall, distinct from, not separate, but distinct above the communication of the human authors. So I look at it in that perspective. More can be said about that. But in regards to the suffering and such, I mean, yeah, that's a really difficult question. And I know that gets into the problem of evil, which is a big discussion in and of itself. And I did a long discussion about that on Scholar Fiction's channel, if somebody wants to watch that. But the way that I would look at it, to give that in brief, is there are a few different things to keep in mind. One, we don't know the psychological state of animals. So I do agree that we do believe animals experience pain of some kind, but I don't know how conscious they are of that. So that can help in some ways in understanding that. But also, if animals have an afterlife, humans suffer and die as well. But the Christian perspective is that this is the stage prior to going to an afterlife where suffering will be ended for those who join God. And then finally, my perspective overall on the problem of evil is I take more of a free process kind of view, that God is limited not in his power, but in how much he can, coerce the laws of nature in this pre-heavenly universe. And that takes some unpacking of that perspective. But I think taking a view like that allows for understanding that it's not God's overall hope that creatures would die and suffer, but it's part of his overall plan is to end suffering, but he is limited in how he interacts with the pre-heavenly universe. I know that takes some unpacking, but that's my view.
A quick question. Are you a theistic evolutionist primarily because the Catholic Church's official doctrine, or because you've done some maybe biology 101 in college and have looked at the evidence and said, okay, there's no way to make that work in either way? I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah. So the Catholic Church leaves it open. So it's not official doctrine that you have to accept evolution, but you're allowed to. So, I mean, that's probably made it easier to reconcile that for me. But I haven't studied the theory a ton, but the little bit I've looked into it, it seems plausible. It also seems plausible from a theological perspective. So going back to Gregory of Nyssa, in like the 4th or 3rd century AD, actually made a kind of evolutionary argument that God would create in a more of a process. And St. Augustine had a similar argument as well. They actually theologically, and certainly Leibniz made this argument as well, that the creationist perspective is a kind of gap reasoning that God has to intervene and do extra things, that in some ways it's more theologically parsimonious and glorifying that God would work through natural law-like regularities. So actually, I think theologically it makes more sense that God would use evolution. Not that that's an open and shut case in favor of theistic evolution, but I see, so Catholic teaching, the theological perspective, and then the scientific data, to me, they all harmonize and make sense. So,
well, you have to admit, evolution is a somewhat brutal way to bring about human beings, opposed to any other way I could think of. I mean, if I had the powers of a god, I can think of so many ways that were just not quite so brutal. In fact, we've all probably heard the quote from Richard Dawkins mentioning that evolution, pitiless indifference of evolutionary theory, that things just go extinct, other things take its place, and how many different organisms survive by causing terrible suffering to other organisms. That's just simply how they continue on. It's something that's difficult to deal with, even when it's a non-thinking, when it's just the way the world works in a naturalist perspective. But I struggle to try to make that work with a deity that's all supposed to care about us, that he would let that be his method when it seems just so brutal and pitiless.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It doesn't seem like that would, but I mean, if you look at it from the creationist perspective, I mean, any reality that God brings about where animals eat each other is going to be brutal. So I don't know that evolution, I mean, yeah, it complicates the picture a little bit, but any universe that God creates where there's death and suffering is going to be one that we wouldn't expect God to create. So then that gets into the problem of evil. And then that's where I kind of have my own theodicy. It's like a free process type view that I think makes sense from my perspective. But yeah, I mean, the problem of evil is a really difficult question.
I find it, maybe you can clarify. You mentioned a while ago that you thought God was limited. How is God limited? In what way is he limited? When you said that, my Calvinist hat popped on my head, and I turned to Ephesians 1:11, which states, "In Him, according to the purpose of Him who accomplishes all things according to the counsel of His will." So, in this perspective, and in the Calvinist perspective, everything that comes about is because of God's will. So, this God, if evolution's true, willed it to happen, and was pleased to do so, to bring about life in different species through this very brutal process of natural selection, where there's this great suffering and death. So it would be in God's plan for all these species to be extinct, and for predators, to attack their prey, for millions and millions of years, just to survive. You think of Christian philosophers and apologists like Alvin Plantinga, who would claim that this is the best of all possible worlds. I think Plantinga just lacks imagination here, and doesn't even recognize in his own Bible that his God is going to bring about a time when there is no pain, suffering, and death, where death will be no more, and God will wipe away every tear from the elect's eyes and so forth. But if evolution is the case, this God, willfully and enjoyably created a world in which there's just so much suffering and death. So I find that really hard to reconcile with the God that created us and loved and wants the best for his creation.
Yeah, so I mean that's definitely a good point. So in regards to Calvinism and everything happening according to God's will, so the Catholic perspective isn't a Calvinist perspective. That, I mean, if somebody does something that's morally evil, I'd argue that wasn't God's will for that to happen. In terms of like approaching a passage like in Ephesians or Romans and so on, everything happens. I would interpret everything happens according to God's plan and will for salvation. That He wills what's good for overall from the eschatological perspective. And I think that's more of Plantinga's view as well. That I think Plantinga's argument is that this is the world that contains the best kinds of goods, and he would argue a world that has the resurrection atonement of Christ is the best kind of world. Now, I'm not defending that argument so much as a theodicy, but I think that's his perspective on that. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that God does get pleasure out of animal suffering. I think that, going back to your question about God being limited, so I don't think God is limited in his power or in his knowledge or in his goodness, but he is morally limited. So God can't lie, God can't be unjust, God can't contradict himself. So he's limited logically and morally. And I would argue that, though not obviously so, but I would argue that could entail that God is limited in how he can justifiably interact with the created world. So somebody like Thomas Ord, although I don't embrace every point of his theodicy, but he argues this kind of point that God is limited by his moral character and how he brings about the world. And I know that that's not the way that's traditionally been argued, but I think there's a lot of plausibility to that.
All right. Do you guys think we've covered all the major points, or is there something more you think we need to discuss first?
I think I hit all the points I wanted to discuss.
Dry, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm good either way. Yeah, I think we covered a lot of the good points.
All right, I think we'll definitely have a future discussion on a different issue. I think it's always good to stick to a particular subject for one of these conversations, to kind of hammer one point out rather than jump to 20 different ones. So this has been a good conversation, although a bit dry. Wink, wink. I think we'll have Dry. Why don't you give us kind of your closing statement, and then Floyd, and then I think we'll wrap up the show. I asked for Q&A outside, but it seems like we've hit so many bases. Everyone's like, well, we can only ask questions based on stuff they've already answered. So, so go ahead, Dry.
Sure, yeah. So my perspective is, again, I think theologically, from Catholic Church teaching, and also scientifically, all of that converges in that evolution is a plausible perspective from the Christian perspective, that you can harmonize it. I do recognize there are some difficulties, but I think that there are plausible answers. I don't see them being in strict contradiction. Some of these issues touch into, how do we understand biblical inspiration? How do we understand the problem of evil? It gets, what's the nature of the soul and so on. And those are really important, and I'm happy to discuss them more. But in general, I mean, I think that evolution is not in conflict with Christianity.
All right, go ahead, Floyd.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to how we should interpret the Bible. I think an important question to ask is, what would Jesus say? Yeah, if we lived 2,000 years ago and we could ask Jesus questions, what would he say about things like how old the Earth is, or when did humans come on the scene, or even questions like, is the world flat or not? That would be an interesting question to ask Jesus. And when we ask, what would Jesus say? I think all we can really do is to appeal to Scripture. You know, uh, mostly the Gospels. In Mark 10, we read, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, male shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So he says, from the beginning of creation, there was there was male and female humans, and evolution obviously does not teach that all. That humans came on the scene rather late in the history of the world. So again, if you ask Jesus what he thought, my guess is Jesus would probably be a young Earth creationist and a flat earther. So I'll just leave it at that.
All right. I think that covers our time for today. Like I said, interesting discussion. For those of you out there who are looking forward to a dumpster fire, you'll have to wait till I believe it's the 22nd, where Arn and Rev News will be battling it out to see who gets thrown out of Shanny's trailer. That's a whole different issue, a whole different thing. However, this is the more thoughtful portion of our show, and so just enjoy the thoughtful discussion. Floyd and Dry Apologist, thank you guys so much for showing up. You brought your A game, and it was very entertaining. For those of you out there who are not entertained, don't worry. There's going to be an MMA boxing match between the two later this week, where they're going to go in there and just kick the living crap out of each other. I wish that's not a thing. I'm lying. It's not true at all. All right. So guys, hey, thank you again for showing up, and I look forward to booking you guys a later date for some more theological discussions. You both were awesome.
Yeah, thank
Although
you.
Floyd, I do miss your PowerPoint presentations. I want one of those next time.
Yeah, I have a few in the can.
Yeah, if you're in the can. Yeah, maybe we get a presuppositionalist on here. Not someone so reasonable like a Catholic. Catholics are so annoyingly reasonable, accepting science and all that. What is with you accepting science? You're supposed to be fighting against that, so we can yell at you. I do have one quick throwaway question. Just if we had no science at all when it came to study of life, like there was just kind of a blank slate, do you think you'd lean towards what Southern Baptists kind of lean towards, the more old and young Earth creationism?
I mean, I don't know, because if we didn't have science, I don't know that we'd be able to determine a perspective. It would probably just be an open question how God brought it about.
Well, I guess like if you just had only the Bible as your source for information about how the biology works.
Sure.
Would you still be? Because it seems that Catholics did not consider it all that open. That they kind of leaned towards creationism up until evolutionary theory started picking up a lot of steam.
Sure. Yeah, that's true. Certainly the more natural perspective, just from a simplistic standpoint, like how would a God have done it? Well, he could have just created it ex nihilo right there. That would be the natural leaning. But there were theologians like St. Augustine, St. Gregory of Nyssa, who seemed to have more of an evolutionary type perspective, not saying they were Darwinian, but had that type of perspective, which you can look that up. But the creationist perspective is more immediate, but I don't see that as problematic.
All right. Well, I think that covers our time. I think we're good. Again, Floyd, Dry, thank you for joining us. And for all those out there, we look forward to seeing you at future shows. Thank you all for watching.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.